10 days ago, 4 people began their journey to travel farther from Earth than any human being has ever travelled. And for 7 of those 10 days, the radiation alarms inside their spacecraft never stopped. Not once. 7 straight days of particle bombardment that no shield could fully block, no shelter could permanently fix, and no mission planner had confidently predicted. Artemis II was supposed to be the first step toward Mars. Instead, it might prove that we were never meant to go to Mars. What the crew brought back is not triumph, it is a warning. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that warning says and why it reveals something humanity simply isn't ready to hear. If this has you hooked, subscribe to the Sky Lab so you do not miss what comes next. Because this story is not over, it is just starting to hit the data. Drop a comment below. I want to know where in the world you're watching this, what time it is for you, and your honest take. A heat shield that has never been tested at Mars speeds, radiation levels that exceed career limits on a single trip, a human body that starts breaking down within months. Are we looking at a longer timeline to Mars or the beginning of the realization that we were never going there at all? Tell me what you think. Now settle in and let us get into it. Part 1. The claim. No one wants to say out loud. There is a moment during every crewed spaceflight that nobody talks about at the press conferences. It lasts about 5 minutes. And during those 5 minutes, the most advanced spacecraft ever built by human hands becomes, for all practical purposes, a falling rock wrapped in fire. Tonight, the Orion capsule carrying 4 human beings slammed into Earth's atmosphere at roughly 11 kilometers per second. That is Mach 32. 32 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the air in front of the spacecraft doesn't just heat up, it ionizes. The molecules themselves are ripped apart into a superheated plasma sheath that wraps around the vehicle like a cocoon made of lightning. And that plasma does something terrifying. It cuts off all communication. No telemetry, no voice, no signal of any kind gets in or out. Mission control in Houston goes quiet. The families watching from the visitor stands go quiet. The entire world, for 5 minutes, has no idea whether those 4 people are alive or dead. This is not a malfunction. This is how physics works at those speeds, and we have known about it since the 1960s. We knew about it during Mercury, we knew about it during Gemini, we knew about it during Apollo, and 60 years later, with all of our computational power, all of our material science, all of our simulation technology, we still cannot talk to our astronauts during the most dangerous phase of their mission. We just wait. Now here is the part that should bother you. Artemis II was sold to the public as a triumph. And in many ways it was. 4 astronauts, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, travelled farther from Earth than any human beings in history. They looped around the far side of the Moon at a distance of roughly 400,000 kilometres, and they came home. That is an extraordinary accomplishment. But the word that kept showing up in the post-mission briefings was not triumph. It was survival. And those 2 words mean very different things. Because what Artemis II actually demonstrated, if you look at the data instead of the press releases, is that human spaceflight beyond low Earth orbit is still balanced on a razor's edge. The heat shield had been redesigned after unexplained failures on the uncrewed test flight. The radiation environment exceeded baseline models for 7 consecutive days. A geomagnetic storm hit during the return phase, and the re-entry itself, that 11 km per second plunge through a wall of plasma, was the fastest any crewed vehicle has ever attempted. Let me say that again. In 2026, we performed the fastest crewed re-entry in human history. Not in 1969, not in 1972, right now, this year. That should tell you something about where we actually stand. The surface temperature on the heat shield during that re-entry reached approximately 2,760 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to melt steel, titanium, and most engineering alloys. The only thing standing between 4 human beings and incineration was a layer of ablative material called AV coat, a substance that is designed to char and erode in a controlled fashion, carrying heat away from the vehicle as it burns off. It worked. But, and this is the part NASA was less eager to discuss publicly, it worked under conditions that were different from the ones it had been tested for. We will come back to that. The point is this: Artemis II succeeded, the crew is home, the capsule is being examined, and the mission is already being framed as the foundation for Artemis III, the first crewed lunar landing since 1972, and eventually for the long horizon goal that every space agency and every billionaire keeps promising: Mars. And that is exactly why this matters. Because if Artemis II is the stepping stone, then we need to look very carefully at what it actually proved. Not what we wanted it to prove, not what the headlines say it proved, what the physics, the biology and the math say it proved. 54 years passed between Apollo 17 and Artemis II, more than half a century. And in that time, we did not solve the radiation problem. We did not solve the heat shield problem. We did not solve the long-duration life support problem. What we did was build a capsule that is marginally safer, significantly heavier, and substantially more expensive than the one we flew to the moon in 1972. And we sent it on a mission that was deliberately, carefully, almost surgically designed to minimize risk. That is not confidence. That is caution. And caution is not a stepping stone. It is an admission. So here is the question no one at NASA, no one at SpaceX, no one in Congress wants to answer honestly. If this is step 1, a 10-day flyby with no landing, no docking, no orbital insertion, and a heat shield that had to be redesigned between flights, what does step 10 look like? What does a 900-day mission to Mars look like when we are still barely holding on to a 10-day trip to the moon? Artemis II did not prove we are ready for Mars. It proved we are barely holding on to the moon. And if you follow the numbers, not the dreams, not the timelines, not the TED Talks, but the actual numbers, what you find on the other side is something we are not ready to hear. Stay with me, because this is going to get worse before it makes sense. Part 2, the mission profile, but read between the lines. The trajectory that Artemis II flew has a name in orbital mechanics. It is called a free return trajectory, and it is the safest possible path you can take to the moon. The concept is simple. You launch the spacecraft, aim it so that the moon's gravity bends the flight path into a figure-8 loop, and the vehicle swings back toward Earth without ever needing to fire its engine again. Gravity does the work. If every system on board failed simultaneously, every thruster, every computer, every piece of navigation equipment, the crew would still come home, the universe itself would bring them back. That sounds elegant, and it is. But it is also a confession. Think about what that trajectory means in practical terms. Orion never entered lunar orbit. It never performed an orbital insertion burn, which is one of the most complex and failure-sensitive maneuvers in spaceflight. It never docked with another vehicle. It never deployed a lander. It never tested long-duration habitation systems. It never attempted a surface rendezvous. It flew to the moon, and it flew back. That is the mission. And the reason that is the mission is not because NASA lacked ambition. It is because the engineering was not ready for anything more. Compare this to Apollo 13, a mission we remember as a disaster. In 1970, 3 astronauts suffered a catastrophic oxygen tank explosion halfway to the moon. They lost their primary life support, their main engine, and most of their electrical power. And yet that crew still performed a manual course correction burn, used the lunar module as a lifeboat, navigated using the sun as a reference point, and executed a re-entry sequence that required precision timing down to the second. Apollo 13 attempted, and survived, more operational complexity under emergency conditions than Artemis II attempted under nominal ones. That comparison is not meant to diminish Artemis, it is meant to recalibrate what we think progress looks like. Because from the outside, Artemis II looks like the next chapter. From the inside, from the engineering side, it looks like a system that is still learning to walk. And that matters enormously when the destination everyone keeps talking about is not the moon, it is Mars. The central thread here is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Artemis II was intentionally simplified because the environment it flew through, the radiation, the thermal loads, the communication gaps, is still too dangerous to fully engage with. The mission design reflects caution dressed up as confidence, and if we cannot even test our systems aggressively at lunar distance, the idea that we are 10 or 15 years away from sending humans to Mars is not optimism, it is fantasy. But here is where the story takes a turn that most people have not heard about. Because the part of Artemis II that came closest to genuine failure was not the trajectory, not the radiation, and not the isolation. It was the heat shield, and what happened with that heat shield is a story that should make you deeply uncomfortable about what comes next. Part 3. the heat shield decision nobody agrees on. In December of 2022, NASA's uncrewed Artemis I mission completed a 25-day test flight around the Moon. The Orion capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, and the mission was declared a success. But when engineers pulled the heat shield out of the water and brought it back to the lab, they found something they did not expect. More than 100 locations on the Avcoat heat shield showed charring, cracking, and material loss that exceeded pre-flight predictions. Pieces of the ablative coating had broken away during re-entry in ways that the thermal models had not anticipated. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to understand how Avcoat works. It is not a heat-resistant shell like the tiles on the space shuttle. It is an ablative system, which means it is designed to erode. The material absorbs heat, chars, and the charred layer peels or burns away, carrying thermal energy with it. It is, in essence, a controlled sacrifice. The shield destroys itself to save the crew. And for that process to work, the rate of destruction has to be predictable. You need to know, down to the millimetre, how much material will be lost at every point on the surface, at every moment during re-entry. If the erosion is too slow, heat penetrates the structure. If it is too fast, you run out of shield before you run out of atmosphere. What Artemis I revealed is that the erosion was not predictable, not fully. The root cause, as NASA's investigation eventually determined, was gas buildup inside the AV coat material during the skip re-entry manoeuvre. Artemis I used a technique where the capsule dips into the atmosphere, skips back out like a stone on water, then re-enters a second time. This approach spreads the heating load over a longer period and allows for more precise splashdown targeting. But it also creates a thermal cycling pattern: heat, cool, heat again, that caused gases trapped inside the ablative material to expand and contract, generating internal pressure that cracked and ejected chunks of the shield. NASA's response was significant. For Artemis II, they made two major changes. First, they abandoned the skip re-entry entirely and switched to a direct entry profile, one continuous plunge through the atmosphere. Second, they reformulated the AV coat material itself, reducing its permeability from 6% to effectively 0%, creating a denser shield that would trap less gas internally. Those sound like reasonable fixes, and they may well be. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that a retired NASA engineer named Charles Kamada has been raising publicly, loudly, and with increasing frustration. The redesigned heat shield, with its new material formulation and its new re-entry profile, had never been tested at lunar return velocity with a crew on board. The direct entry profile subjects the shield to a different heating distribution than the skip entry. The zero permeability material behaves differently under thermal stress than the 6% permeability version, and these two changes were implemented together, which means you cannot isolate the effect of either one. In standard aerospace engineering practice, the sequence is supposed to go like this: identify the problem, develop a fix, test the fix in the relevant environment, validate the results, then put humans on board. What happened with Artemis II was different. The problem was identified, the fix was developed, the relevant environment was lunar velocity re-entry, and the test was the crewed mission itself. Kamada's specific concern was about crack propagation in the denser AV coat formulation. When you reduce permeability, you change the material's internal stress response. Gas that previously could vent through microchannels is now trapped, and if a crack initiates, from a manufacturing defect, a micrometeoroid impact, or simple thermal stress, it may propagate differently in the new material than it would have in the old one. This is not speculation. It is materials science, and the data set for this specific failure mode, in this specific material, at this specific velocity, is exactly one data point: Artemis II itself. Let me connect this back to the thread that runs through everything we are discussing. The heat shield is the single most critical system during re-entry. If it fails, the crew dies. There is no backup, there is no abort option, there is no rescue. And for Artemis II, the heat shield that protected those 4 astronauts was, in a very real sense, an untested configuration flying for the first time with humans behind it. It worked. Thank God it worked. But it worked is not the same as we understand why it worked, and we understand why it worked is not the same as we can guarantee it will work again. Now consider what Mars demands: A spacecraft returning from Mars will hit Earth's atmosphere at roughly 14 kilometers per second. That is 3 kilometers per second faster than Artemis. And in the physics of atmospheric re-entry, speed does not scale linearly with heating. Radiative heating scales with approximately the 8th power of velocity. That means a 30% increase in speed produces roughly an 8-fold increase in radiative heat load. The thermal environment of a Mars return is not slightly worse than a lunar return. It is categorically different. It exists in a regime that no crewed vehicle has ever entered, that no heat shield has ever been tested in, and that no material we currently possess has been validated for. If Artemis needed a last-minute workaround to survive lunar re-entry, Mars return velocity is not an engineering challenge. It is an open question in applied physics, and we are nowhere close to answering it. But the heat shield was not the only thing pushing Artemis II to its limits. Because while the engineers were worrying about the thermal protection system, the Sun was doing something that no one on the mission could control, and no amount of engineering could fully prepare for. Part 4. The timing nobody controlled. 3 days into the Artemis II mission, space weather sensors detected a G2 geomagnetic storm, a moderate disturbance in Earth's magnetic field triggered by activity on the Sun. By mid-mission, an M7.5 solar flare had erupted from an active sunspot region, sending a burst of energetic particles streaming through the inner solar system. And on the day of re-entry, a G1 geomagnetic storm was still active, the tail end of a coronal hole high-speed stream that had been buffeting Earth's magnetosphere for days. None of these events were catastrophic on their own. A G2 storm is significant but not rare. An M-class flare is powerful but below the X-class threshold that triggers the most serious alerts. The point is not that any single event was extraordinary. The point is that all of them happened during a 10-day mission, and not one of them could have been predicted with enough lead time to delay or alter the flight. Artemis II launched during the peak phase of solar cycle 25, when the Sun's magnetic activity is at its most volatile. During this phase, coronal mass ejections, solar flares, and high-speed solar wind streams become more frequent and more intense. Radiation monitors on the Orion spacecraft recorded continuous elevated electron flux exceeding 1,000 particle flux units for approximately 7 consecutive days. That is not a spike, that is a sustained bombardment. And here is what connects this directly to the argument we are building. Artemis II was a 10-day mission, 10 days, and in those 10 days the crew was exposed to multiple space weather events that required monitoring, assessment, and at one point active shelter preparation. They got lucky, not because the events were harmless, but because none of them escalated to the level where the mission would have been in genuine jeopardy. A stronger flare, a faster coronal mass ejection, a direct hit from an X-class event, any of these would have turned a successful mission into a crisis. You cannot engineer luck. You cannot schedule around solar activity with the precision required for a 3-year Mars mission. And you cannot outrun a particle travelling at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The Sun does what the Sun does, and for 10 days, it cooperated. But cooperation is not a design parameter, and that realization that even a short mission to the Moon depends partly on the Sun deciding not to kill you is one of the most important lessons Artemis II taught us. It is also the perfect introduction to the problem that, more than any other, makes Mars colonization a mathematical impossibility with current technology. Not the heat shield, not the engines, not the cost, the radiation. And what Artemis II revealed about radiation exposure in deep space is something that should fundamentally change how we talk about the future of human spaceflight. Part 5. Leaving Earth's protection. You live inside a force field. You have lived inside it every day of your life, and you have never once felt it, seen it, or thought about it. It is called the magnetosphere, and it is generated by the convection of molten iron in Earth's outer core, producing a magnetic field that extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space. That field does something extraordinary. It deflects the vast majority of charged particles that stream through the solar system, protons, electrons, heavy ions, and channels them toward the poles, where they produce the auroras. Without the magnetosphere, those particles would strike the surface directly, stripping the atmosphere over geological time and irradiating every living thing on the planet. You are, right now, shielded by a magnetic bubble that has protected every organism on Earth for billions of years. And the moment a spacecraft crosses beyond that bubble, that protection vanishes entirely. The boundary is not sharp, it is a gradient. As you climb in altitude, you first pass through the Van Allen radiation belts, two donut-shaped zones of trapped charged particles, the inner belt dominated by high-energy protons, the outer by electrons. The International Space Station orbits at roughly 400 kilometers below the inner belt, and its crew still receives elevated radiation compared to the surface, but they are within the magnetosphere. They are still inside the shield. Artemis II was not. Once Orion crossed beyond the magnetopause, the outer boundary of Earth's magnetic influence, the crew entered an environment that is, from a radiation perspective, fundamentally different from anything experienced in low Earth orbit. And this is the critical distinction that most public discussions of spaceflight completely ignore. The ISS is dangerous, but it is not deep space. Deep space is something else entirely. In deep space, you are exposed to two primary sources of ionizing radiation. The first is solar energetic particles, or SEPs, bursts of protons and heavier ions, accelerated by solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These events are sporadic, sometimes violent, and impossible to predict more than a few hours in advance. The second source is galactic cosmic rays, or GCRs, high-energy particles originating from outside the solar system, accelerated by supernova remnants and other extreme astrophysical events. GCRs are constant. They do not surge and recede like solar particles. They are always there, always penetrating, and they carry energies that make them almost impossible to shield against with any practical amount of material. The Artemis II crew spent approximately 9 days beyond Earth's magnetosphere. During that time, their cumulative radiation dose was roughly equivalent to what a person on the surface of the Earth would receive in an entire year. 1 day in deep space equaled 1 year of normal background radiation, and that ratio is not an estimate. It is based on the readings from 6 onboard radiation sensors that tracked exposure continuously throughout the mission. Now, the human body can tolerate some radiation. We are exposed to it constantly from natural sources: radon gas, cosmic rays that penetrate the atmosphere, medical imaging. But there is a difference between background exposure and deep space exposure, and it is not just a matter of quantity, it is a matter of quality. GCRs include heavy ions, iron nuclei, for example, that carry enormous kinetic energy. When one of these ions passes through biological tissue, it does not just deposit energy along a narrow track the way a photon from an X-ray does. It shatters the DNA double helix. It creates clusters of damage, double-strand breaks, crosslinks, base deletions that the cell's repair machinery struggles to fix. And when repair fails, the result is either cell death or worse, a mutation that survives and replicates. That is how cancer begins. NASA maintains a carrier exposure limit for astronauts of 600 millisieverts. That limit is based on a statistical model that estimates the additional lifetime cancer risk from radiation exposure. At 600 millisieverts, the estimated excess risk is approximately 3%. That sounds low until you remember that it is an average, that individual susceptibility varies enormously, that the models themselves carry significant uncertainty, and that the limit is a policy decision, not a biological threshold. There is no dose below which radiation is guaranteed to be safe. There is only a dose below which we have decided the risk is acceptable. The Artemis II crew accumulated somewhere in the range of 12 to 15 millisieverts during their 9-day mission. That is well within the career limit. For a short mission, the numbers work. But here is where the central thread of this story reasserts itself with the force of arithmetic. Because Artemis II lasted 9 days, a Mars mission lasts 900, and when you multiply the daily exposure rate across that timeline, the numbers do not just get worse, they break. We will get to that math in a moment, but first, there is something that happened on Flight Day 8 of Artemis II that most people never heard about, something that reveals just how primitive our current radiation protection really is. Part 6. The 7-day radiation event. For 7 consecutive days during the Artemis II mission, the onboard radiation monitors recorded electron flux levels that remained continuously above 1,000 particle flux units. At peak, the readings exceeded 10,000 PFU. To put that in context, nominal background in deep space during solar minimum, the calmest the sun gets, runs in the low hundreds. What Artemis II flew through was not nominal. It was an extended radiation environment driven by a combination of solar energetic particle events and high-speed solar wind streams from coronal holes on the Sun's surface. The 6 radiation sensors distributed throughout the Orion capsule tracked the exposure in real time, feeding data to both the crew and mission control. And on flight day 8, the crew performed something that had never been done before in operational spaceflight. They built a radiation shelter. The procedure is called HERA, Human Exploration Radiation Assessment, and it involves the crew repositioning equipment bags, water containers, and other dense materials inside the capsule to create an improvised shielding barrier around the sleeping area. The concept is simple. Mass blocks particles. Water, which contains hydrogen, the lightest element, and one of the most effective radiation absorbers per unit mass, can reduce dose rates when stacked between the crew and the radiation source. The crew practiced this drill, assembled the shelter, and evaluated its effectiveness using the onboard sensors. It helped, modestly. The dose rate inside the shelter was measurably lower than outside it. But the shelter was designed for temporary use, roughly 24 hours of protection during a severe solar particle event. It was not a permanent solution. It could not be maintained for days or weeks without disrupting mission operations. And it offered virtually no protection against galactic cosmic rays, which carry enough energy to penetrate meters of material, let alone a wall of repurposed cargo bags. This is the state-of-the-art in human radiation protection for deep space in 2026. We build a fort out of luggage, and the reason we build a fort out of luggage is that we do not have active shielding technology. There is no electromagnetic field generator small enough and powerful enough to deflect GCRs from a crewed spacecraft. There is no pharmaceutical countermeasure that can prevent radiation damage to DNA in real time. There is no material light enough to launch into space that can block the full spectrum of deep space radiation without generating secondary particles, neutrons, and other fragments that are themselves dangerous. The HERA shelter on Artemis II was not a solution. It was an acknowledgement. It was NASA saying, in the language of engineering, we know we cannot protect you from this environment, so here is the best we can do for now. And the reason that matters, the reason it connects directly to the central argument of everything we are discussing, is that Artemis II lasted 9 days. The shelter was needed for one event, one solar storm during one short mission. A Mars crew would spend 900 days in that same environment, and they would need protection not for one event, but for every event, plus the continuous background of galactic cosmic rays that never stops. There is no fort made of luggage that solves that problem, and as we are about to see, the math makes it terrifyingly clear why. Part 7. The math that breaks Mars. Let me walk you through the numbers, because the numbers are where the dream of Mars colonization runs into a wall that no amount of optimism can climb over. A round-trip mission to Mars, using current propulsion technology, looks roughly like this. 6 to 9 months of transit from Earth to Mars, approximately 500 days on the Martian surface, waiting for the orbital alignment that allows a return trajectory. Then another 6 to 9 months of transit back to Earth. Total mission duration, somewhere between roughly 900 and 1080 days. Call it approximately 2.5 to 3 years. During the transit phases, the crew is in deep space, fully exposed to both solar energetic particles and galactic cosmic rays, with no planetary body or magnetic field providing any shielding whatsoever. During the surface stay, Mars offers some protection. The planet itself blocks radiation from below, and the thin Martian atmosphere provides a small amount of overhead shielding, but Mars has no global magnetic field. The atmosphere is less than 1% the density of Earth's. The surface radiation dose on Mars is roughly 233 microsieverts per day, which is about 60% of the deep space transit dose. When you run the full calculation, transit exposure plus surface exposure plus a statistical allowance for 1 or 2 moderate solar particle events during the mission, the total estimated dose for a Mars round trip comes to approximately 1010 millisieverts. Let me put that number in context. NASA's career limit for astronauts is 600 millisieverts. A Mars mission exceeds that limit by nearly 70%. A single trip to Mars and back would give every crew member more radiation than NASA considers acceptable for an entire career. And that 600 millisievert limit is not conservative. It corresponds to roughly a 3% increase in lifetime cancer mortality risk. At 1010 millisieverts, the estimated excess risk rises to somewhere between 5 and 10%, depending on the model, the crew member's age, sex, and individual radiation sensitivity. Some models put the upper uncertainty bound as high as 20%, 1 in 5, a 1 in 5 chance that the mission gives you cancer that kills you. The European Space Agency has been even more direct about this. In published assessments, ESA has stated that a crewed Mars mission is not currently viable due to radiation exposure, not challenging, not requiring further study, not viable. And here is why shielding does not solve the problem. It seems intuitive that you could just add more material around the spacecraft, thicker walls, more water, denser composites, and block the radiation. But galactic cosmic rays are not ordinary radiation. A GCR heavy ion can carry billions of electron volts of kinetic energy. When it strikes a shield, aluminum, polyethylene, even water, it does not just stop, it fragments. It produces a shower of secondary particles, neutrons, pions, lighter ions, that spray through the interior of the spacecraft. In some cases, the secondary radiation inside the vehicle is actually worse than the primary radiation outside it. This is called secondary particle generation, and it means that beyond a certain thickness, adding more shielding makes the problem worse, not better. There is an optimal shielding thickness for any given material, a point where you get the maximum net dose reduction. For aluminum, that optimum is roughly 20 to 30 centimeters. For polyethylene, it is somewhat better. For water, somewhat better still. But even at the optimum, the dose reduction for GCRs is only about 20 to 30%. You cannot get to zero. You cannot get close to zero. You can shave the margins, and the margins are not enough. Let me bring this back to the core of what we are arguing. Artemis II spent 9 days in deep space and accumulated a modest dose. That dose was manageable because the mission was short. But a Mars mission is 100 times longer, and the dose scales accordingly. There is no material solution that reduces a 1000 millisievert exposure to a 600 millisievert exposure without making the spacecraft so heavy that it cannot be launched. There is no operational workaround. You cannot fly faster with current engines. You cannot shorten the surface stay below the orbital window. You cannot evacuate the crew if a solar storm hits during transit. This is not a delay. It is a ceiling. A hard, physical ceiling imposed by the interaction between high-energy particles and human biology. And until someone invents either a material that can stop galactic cosmic rays without generating secondary radiation, or a compact magnetic field generator that can deflect them, or a biological intervention that makes human DNA resistant to ionizing radiation, none of which currently exist even in prototype, that ceiling holds. The dream of Mars colonization does not fail because of rockets. It does not fail because of funding. It fails because the universe is trying to kill you every second you spend outside Earth's magnetic field, and right now, we have no answer for that. But if the sustained, chronic exposure is the slow killer, there is another scenario that is far more sudden, far more violent, and far more relevant to this conversation than most people realize. Because there was a moment in spaceflight history when the line between a successful mission and a dead crew was not engineering or skill. It was timing. Pure, blind, stupid timing. Part 8. The event that would have killed them. In August of 1972, between the Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 missions, the Sun produced one of the most powerful solar particle events ever recorded. The August 4th event, as it is now known, released a torrent of high-energy protons that, had they struck an unshielded human in deep space, would have delivered an estimated dose of roughly 26 sieverts. Not millisieverts, sieverts. To put that in perspective, a dose of 5 sieverts is considered universally lethal within weeks. 26 sieverts would have killed an astronaut within hours. Massive organ failure, destruction of the bone marrow, collapse of the central nervous system. Apollo 16 returned to Earth in April of 1972. Apollo 17 launched in December of 1972. The August storm fell almost exactly in the middle of that gap. If either mission had been shifted by a few months, if Apollo 16 had launched late, or if Apollo 17 had launched early, the crew would have been in deep space, beyond Earth's magnetosphere, during the most lethal solar event of the 20th century. They would have died. There was no shielding on the Apollo command module that could have reduced a 26 sievert dose to survivable levels. There was no shelter protocol, no radiation bunker, no emergency procedure that would have saved them. They would have received a lethal dose within minutes, and they would have died in space, and there is nothing anyone could have done about it. This is not hypothetical speculation. This is a historical fact applied to a counterfactual timeline that missed reality by weeks. Now apply this to Artemis II. The same sun, the same physics, the same unpredictability. Orion's Hera shelter offers meaningful protection against moderate solar particle events, the kind that produce doses in the tens or low hundreds of millisieverts. It offers no protection against a 1972 class event. The shelter would have reduced the dose, yes, but not by enough. Not by nearly enough. The crew of Artemis II was in deep space for 9 days. During those 9 days, the sun cooperated. It threw some moderate punches, the G2 storm, the M-class flare, but nothing in the X-class range, and nothing remotely approaching the August 72 event. They were not hit with the big one, and the reason they were not hit with the big one is not that we predicted it would not happen, or that we engineered against it, or that our model said the probability was low enough to accept. The reason is luck. Mission survival in deep space is still probabilistic, not controlled. That sentence should be printed on the wall of every conference room where Mars mission planning takes place. Because luck does not scale, you can be lucky for 10 days. Being lucky for 900 is a different proposition entirely, and the math of probability says that over the course of a 3-year Mars mission, the chance of encountering at least one severe solar particle event is not negligible. It is, depending on where you are in the solar cycle, somewhere between 15 and 25%. 1 in 4. Roll a 4-sided die, and if it comes up 1, your crew receives a dose that may be lethal and is certainly career-ending, on a mission from which there is no early return. That is the reality of deep space human exploration in 2026. And it connects to everything else we have discussed: the heat shield that needed a workaround, the trajectory that was deliberately conservative, the radiation environment that exceeded expectations on a short mission. All of it points in the same direction. We are not conquering space, we are negotiating with it, and the terms of that negotiation get worse the farther we go and the longer we stay. But radiation is only one of the ways that space is trying to kill you. Because the environment between Earth and Mars is not the empty void it appears to be in photographs. It is something far more hostile than silence, and what Artemis II observed during its transit reveals a reality that most people have never considered. Part 9. The Meteoroid Observation. During the lunar transit phase of Artemis II, the crew made an observation that has not received nearly the attention it deserves. While passing near the lunar surface, they documented 6 meteoroid impacts on the Moon within a single hour. 6 visible flashes, objects striking the surface at speeds of tens of kilometers per second, releasing enough energy on impact to be observed from orbit. This was the first time in human history that meteoroid strikes had been observed directly by a crew in deep space. Robotic cameras and ground-based telescopes have been recording lunar impacts for years, but having human eyes on the phenomenon in real time, from a vantage point that no person had occupied in over 5 decades, added something that telemetry cannot capture: scale, context, the visceral understanding that the space between worlds is not empty, it is a shooting gallery. Now, 6 impacts in 1 hour on the lunar surface might sound modest. The Moon is a large target, over 38 million square kilometers of surface area, and 6 impacts spread across that area represents an extremely low probability of hitting any given point. But the Moon has no atmosphere. Every particle, no matter how small, reaches the surface at full velocity. There is no friction, no ablation, no deceleration. A grain of sand moving at 20 kilometers per second carries the kinetic energy of a small caliber bullet, and the Moon, with its cratered face, is a 4 billion year record of what happens to an unprotected surface in this environment. This connects directly to the central argument, because Mars is often presented as a safer destination than the Moon in terms of surface impacts. Mars has an atmosphere after all, but that atmosphere is thin. Surface pressure is less than 1% of Earth's. It will burn up the smallest micrometeorites, yes, but anything larger than a few millimeters will reach the surface with lethal velocity. And for a transit vehicle or a surface habitat, the threat is not a single catastrophic impact. It is the cumulative effect of constant bombardment by microparticles that erode surfaces, degrade seals, pit optical components, and slowly compromise the structural integrity of any object exposed to the environment over months and years. Shielding a habitat against this kind of erosion is possible, but it adds mass, complexity, and maintenance requirements that compound every other logistical challenge of a Mars mission. And the models we use to estimate impact frequency may be underestimates. The Artemis II observation, limited as it was, suggests that the near-lunar environment is at least as active as predicted, and possibly more so. When you extend that to a 9-month transit through interplanetary space, the cumulative exposure to microparticle impacts becomes a design constraint that has not been fully addressed. Space does not look hostile, it looks serene, silent, empty. But what Artemis II showed, in this small but telling observation, is that the silence is an illusion, and that illusion becomes more dangerous the longer you stay. Part 10. The illusion of empty space. There is a reason that every photograph of space looks the same, a black field dotted with points of light, occasionally interrupted by a planet or a nebula. Our eyes evolved to detect visible light, and in visible light the space between objects appears to be nothing, a void, an absence. But that appearance is one of the most dangerous misconceptions in human spaceflight, because the space between Earth and Mars is not empty. It is saturated with things that want to destroy your spacecraft. We have already discussed the radiation environment, the constant stream of galactic cosmic rays, and the intermittent bursts of solar energetic particles. But radiation is only one component of the interplanetary medium. The solar wind itself, a continuous outflow of charged plasma from the sun's corona, exerts pressure on every surface it touches. It carries embedded magnetic fields that interact with spacecraft electronics. It creates a dynamic, fluctuating electromagnetic environment that can induce currents in wiring, degrade solar panels, and interfere with communication systems. Then there are the microparticles, dust grains, fragments of ancient cometary debris, shattered remnants of asteroidal collisions, all of it drifting through interplanetary space at relative velocities that can exceed 50 kilometers per second. At those speeds, a particle the size of a grain of rice carries the kinetic energy of a hand grenade. Spacecraft in low Earth orbit already deal with this threat. The ISS has had to perform debris avoidance maneuvers dozens of times, and its cupola windows have been replaced due to impact damage. But the ISS is in a relatively well-tracked environment. In interplanetary space, there is no tracking network, there is no warning system, there is just probability. And here is the key insight that ties this back to the central thread. Single event risks, a meteoroid impact, a solar flare, a system malfunction, can be analysed individually, and for any given event the probability may be acceptably low. But a Mars mission is not a single event. It is 900 days of continuous exposure to every one of these hazards simultaneously, and risk accumulates. A 1 in 10,000 daily probability of a micro-impact penetrating the hull becomes a 1 in 11 probability over 900 days. A 1 in 100 chance of a severe solar storm per month becomes a near certainty over 30 months. The environment is not empty. It is actively hostile, and its hostility does not announce itself with a single dramatic event. It grinds, it erodes, it degrades every material, every seal, every system on the spacecraft, day after day, for years. Satellites in interplanetary space lose efficiency, degrade in performance, and eventually fail, not because of a single malfunction, but because of the cumulative punishment of an environment that never stops attacking. Artemis II was out there for 9 days. The thermal coatings on Orion showed measurable changes. The solar arrays showed measurable particle impacts. The external surfaces showed measurable degradation. Multiply those changes by a factor of 100, and you begin to understand the engineering challenge of keeping a crewed vehicle functional for a Mars round trip. Not just alive, functional, capable of performing the systems it needs to perform for a safe return. We are not building vehicles for this, not yet. And the gap between what we have and what we need is not a matter of incremental improvement. It is a matter of material science breakthroughs that have not yet occurred. That is the reality. And it gets worse when you stop thinking about the spacecraft and start thinking about the people inside it. Part 11. The Body Breakdown Timeline. The human body is a biological machine that evolved over millions of years under a very specific set of conditions. 1 gravity, 1 atmosphere of pressure, a 24-hour light-dark cycle, and a magnetic shield against cosmic radiation. Remove any one of those conditions, and the body begins to malfunction. Remove all of them, as a Mars mission would, and the malfunctions compound into a cascading failure that no exercise regimen, no pharmaceutical intervention, and no amount of willpower can fully prevent. Start with the bones. In microgravity, the skeleton begins to demineralize almost immediately. Without the constant mechanical loading that gravity provides, every step, every movement, every moment of standing upright, the osteoclasts, the cells that break down bone, outpace the osteoblasts, the cells that build it up. The net result is a loss of roughly 1 to 1.5% of bone mineral density per month, concentrated in the load-bearing bones of the hips, spine, and legs. Over a 6 to 9 month transit to Mars, an astronaut can lose 10 to 15% of their bone density. That is equivalent to decades of age-related bone loss compressed into months, and the loss does not fully reverse upon return to gravity. Studies of long-duration ISS crews have shown that even a year after landing, some astronauts have not recovered their pre-flight bone density. The muscles follow a similar trajectory. Without gravity to work against, skeletal muscles, particularly the postural muscles of the legs and back, begin to atrophy. Losses of 20 to 30% of muscle mass have been documented in ISS crews over 6-month missions, despite a daily exercise protocol that requires more than 2 hours of resistance and aerobic training. 2 hours a day, every day, for months, and you still lose a fifth of your muscle mass. The exercise does not prevent the loss, it slows it. And on a Mars mission, where the transit is longer, the surface gravity is only 38% of Earth's, and the return transit adds another half year of microgravity. The cumulative effect would be devastating. Then there is the cardiovascular system. In microgravity, the heart does not have to pump against gravity to circulate blood to the brain. Over time, it adapts, which is a polite way of saying it deconditions. The heart muscle weakens, stroke volume decreases, and the cardiovascular system becomes less efficient. When astronauts return to gravity, they experience orthostatic intolerance, dizziness, fainting, and inability to stand upright, because their cardiovascular systems can no longer handle the demand of pumping blood vertically. On a Mars mission, this becomes a mission-critical concern on arrival day. The crew will have spent 6 to 9 months in microgravity. They will land on a planet with 38% gravity. They will need to exit the vehicle, operate in spacesuits, perform physical tasks, and their cardiovascular systems will be deconditioned from months of weightlessness. There is no recovery period built into the mission timeline. You do not get to rest for a month before you start working. You land and you go. The vision problem is perhaps the most alarming, because it was discovered relatively recently and is still poorly understood. It is called Spaceflight-Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, or SANS. In microgravity, fluid that normally pools in the legs redistributes upward toward the head. This increases intracranial pressure, which presses on the optic nerves and reshapes the eyeballs. The result is measurable changes in visual acuity. Some astronauts have returned from the ISS with permanently degraded vision. The mechanism is not fully understood. The long-term consequences are uncertain, and there is no reliable countermeasure. On top of all of this, the immune system suppresses in microgravity. Latent viruses, herpes simplex, Epstein-Barr, varicella, reactivate in astronauts at significantly higher rates than in ground populations. White blood cell function changes, wound healing slows, and all of this is happening in a closed, recirculated atmosphere where any pathogen that takes hold has nowhere to go and 6 hosts to infect. Now compound these effects. A crew arrives at Mars after 9 months of bone loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, potential vision impairment, and immune suppression. They perform 500 days of surface operations in a hostile environment with limited medical capability. Then they spend another 9 months in microgravity for the return trip. The cumulative physiological damage is unlike anything that has been experienced in the history of human spaceflight, because no one has ever been away from 1 gravity conditions for that long. And this is happening on top of the radiation exposure we discussed earlier. Radiation damages DNA. Microgravity impairs the body's ability to repair it. The two effects do not just add, they synergize. The result is a biological environment inside the crew's own bodies that is degrading on multiple fronts simultaneously, with no ability to reset the clock until they return to Earth. The human body is not designed for this. That is not a metaphor. It is a statement of biological fact, and it connects directly to the central argument of this entire discussion. Artemis II lasted 9 days, and the crew came home essentially healthy. But the scaling factor to Mars is not 9 days to 900 days. It is 9 days of manageable risk to 900 days of compounding irreversible biological damage. The body is another ceiling, another hard limit that enthusiasm cannot climb over, and we have not even discussed the part that might be hardest to fix. Because bones can be strengthened with drugs, muscles can be maintained with exercise machines, but the human mind, locked in a tin can for 3 years with no possibility of rescue, no real-time communication with home, and no exit, that is a problem we're only beginning to understand. Part 12. The Psychological Threshold. In 2010, 6 volunteers entered a sealed facility in Moscow and did not come out for 520 days. The Mars 500 experiment conducted by the Russian Academy of Sciences in cooperation with the European Space Agency was the longest duration simulated Mars mission ever attempted. The participants lived and worked in a connected series of modules totaling about 550 cubic meters, roughly the volume of a small house, performing simulated mission tasks, conducting experiments, and communicating with a fictional mission control that introduced realistic communication delays. They did not go to space. They were on the ground the entire time, in a building in Moscow. They could have walked out at any moment, and despite that, the psychological effects were significant. By the midpoint of the simulation, crew members were experiencing disrupted sleep patterns, increased fatigue, decreased motivation, and interpersonal conflicts that affected mission performance. 2 of the 6 crew members became markedly sedentary, spending increasing amounts of time in their bunks. 1 crew member developed a chronic sleep disorder that persisted throughout the rest of the experiment. Social dynamics fractured along lines that the pre-mission psychological screening had not predicted. Psychologists who studied the data identified a phenomenon called the third quarter effect, a predictable psychological low point that occurs approximately 3/4 of the way through any long-duration isolated mission. It shows up in Antarctic winter over crews, in submarine deployments, in long-duration hospital stays. The mind, knowing that the endpoint is still far away but that the novelty of the experience has worn off, enters a state of depleted motivation that can manifest as depression, irritability, withdrawal, or reckless behaviour. On a Mars mission, the third quarter point would fall during the surface stay, the phase when crew performance is most critical, when they are farthest from home, and when the communication delay is at its maximum. A message sent from Mars takes between 4 and 24 minutes to reach Earth, depending on orbital position. A reply takes the same. That means a conversation that would take 30 seconds on the phone becomes an hour-long exchange of one-way messages. There is no real-time interaction, no spontaneous support from family, no ability to call a therapist and have an immediate response. The crew is psychologically alone in a way that no human has ever experienced, and there is one factor that distinguishes a Mars mission from every isolation analogue we have ever studied. In Mars 500, the participants could quit. On a submarine, the captain can surface. In Antarctica, an evacuation flight can be arranged. On Mars, there is no exit. The crew cannot come home early. They cannot leave the habitat for more than a few hours. They cannot escape each other. They are locked together for 900 days with no possibility of rescue, no possibility of personnel change, and no possibility of early return. If a crew member develops a psychotic episode, and the incidence of acute psychotic breaks in the general population is roughly 1 in 100 per year, compounded by the stress, isolation, and sleep disruption inherent to the mission, there is no psychiatrist, no hospital, no medication beyond what was packed before launch. The crew must manage it themselves, in a habitat the size of a small apartment, while continuing to operate the most complex and dangerous mission in human history. This is another dimension of the scaling problem. Artemis II lasted 10 days. The crew trained together for years. They were in constant communication with mission control. They could see Earth out the window. And yet, even on that short mission, the psychological monitoring protocols were extensive. The crew debriefings focused on interpersonal dynamics, and the mission design included deliberate workload management to prevent fatigue-induced errors. Scale that to 900 days, remove the real-time communication, remove the visual connection to Earth, remove the knowledge that help is a few days away. What you have left is a psychological environment that has no precedent in human experience and no tested countermeasure that we know works. The mind, like the body, like the heat shield, like the radiation dosimeter, it is another system that works at lunar scale and breaks at Mars scale. And this pattern is not a coincidence. It is the pattern. It is the fundamental truth that Artemis II revealed, whether it meant to or not. Mars is not a bigger moon, and the next part of this story will show you exactly why that distinction matters more than anything else. Part 13. The Distance Lie. Here is a number that most people know. The Moon is about 384,000 kilometers from Earth. Artemis II covered that distance, looped around and came back. Total trip, roughly 10 days. Here's a number that most people have heard but have not truly internalized. Mars, at its closest approach, is about 55 million kilometers from Earth. At its farthest, it is 225 million kilometers. The average distance of a realistic transfer orbit is somewhere around 200 million kilometers. Let me put that in perspective. The Moon is about 1 light second away. You could point a flashlight at the Moon and hit it in just over a second. Mars, at average distance, is about 11 light minutes away. The Moon is a day trip in cosmic terms. Mars is the other side of the continent. The ratio is roughly 143 to 1. Mars is about 143 times farther than the Moon. And if Artemis II was a 10-day mission, you might be tempted to think Mars is simply a 1400-day mission, just multiplied up. But that is the lie. That is the assumption that makes Mars sound hard instead of impossible, because distance in space does not scale linearly. Almost nothing about it does. Start with orbital mechanics. You cannot fly to Mars whenever you want. The planets are moving. Earth orbits the Sun in 365 days. Mars orbits in 687. The geometry that allows a fuel-efficient transfer, a Hohmann transfer orbit, only aligns once every 26 months. Miss your window, and you wait 2 years for the next one. This means a Mars mission cannot be shortened by simply going faster, because you need to arrive when Mars is in the right position, and you need the orbital geometry to allow a return. The mission duration is not set by engineering preference, it is set by celestial mechanics. Now consider the energy requirements. Getting to the Moon requires a velocity change, a delta V of roughly 9.4 kilometers per second from low Earth orbit. Getting to Mars on a Hohmann transfer requires approximately 11.5 kilometers per second. That sounds like a modest increase, about 22% more, but delta V is exponential in its relationship to fuel mass. Because of the rocket equation, Tsiolkovsky's equation, every additional unit of velocity requires exponentially more propellant, and you need delta V for the Mars orbit insertion, and the landing, and the ascent from Mars, and the return transfer. The total mission delta V for a Mars round trip is roughly 3 to 4 times that of a lunar round trip, which translates to a fuel mass requirement that is not 3 to 4 times greater, but tens of times greater, depending on the vehicle architecture. And then there is communication. At the Moon, the signal delay is about 1.3 seconds each way. You can have a real-time conversation with the lunar crew. It is slightly awkward, like a bad video call, but it works. At Mars distance, the delay ranges from 4 to 24 minutes each way. That is a minimum of 8 minutes for a single exchange. Ask a question, wait 4 minutes for it to arrive, wait for the response, wait 4 minutes for it to come back. In an emergency where seconds matter, mission control cannot help. They cannot provide real-time guidance. They cannot talk the crew through a procedure. They cannot say abort and have anyone hear it in time. The crew is on their own. Artemis II was a sprint. The crew launched, flew out, flew back, and landed. The distance was manageable. The communication was nearly real-time. The supplies were sufficient for a few weeks. The risk exposure was brief. Mars is not a sprint. It is a siege. A multi-year commitment in an environment where every system, propulsion, life support, radiation protection, thermal management, food, water, air, must function continuously, without resupply, without repair from Earth, and without any possibility of early return. This is not a linear scaling of the same mission. It is a categorical shift, a different kind of thing, and recognizing that difference is essential, because almost every argument for Mars feasibility rests on the assumption that the problems are the same as the Moon's problems, just bigger. They are not. They are different problems, and some of them may not have solutions. One of those problems is the one we touched on earlier and promised to return to, the re-entry problem, the heat shield. Because if Artemis II re-entry at 11 kilometers per second required a last-minute redesign and a configuration that had never been tested with a crew, what does Mars return at 14 kilometers per second require? The answer is something that does not yet exist. Part 14. The re-entry physics wall. The Orion capsule re-entered Earth's atmosphere at approximately 11 kilometers per second. That is 40,000 kilometers per hour. It was the fastest crewed re-entry in history, and the heat shield, the redesigned zero permeability AV coat system, was pushed to the edge of its validated performance envelope. A spacecraft returning from Mars will hit the atmosphere at approximately 14 kilometers per second. That is 50,400 kilometers per hour. The difference is 3 kilometers per second, about 27% faster. That does not sound like much. It sounds like the difference between driving 60 miles per hour and driving 77. A moderate increase. A manageable increase. It is not. In the physics of atmospheric re-entry, aerodynamic heating is a complex function of velocity, and the dominant contributor at hypersonic speeds above about 10 kilometers per second is not convective heating, the friction of air molecules against the surface, but radiative heating. Radiative heating comes from the shock layer itself, the compressed, superheated plasma in front of the vehicle, which becomes so hot that it radiates energy like a star. And radiative heating scales not linearly, not quadratically, but approximately with the 8th power of velocity. Let me make sure that registers. The 8th power. If you increase velocity by a factor of 1.27, from 11 to 14 kilometers per second, the radiative heating increases by a factor of 1.27 to the 8th power. That is approximately 8.2. The radiative heat load on a Mars return vehicle is not 27% higher than on a lunar return vehicle. It is roughly 8 times higher. No crewed vehicle has ever been designed for this environment. No heat shield has ever been tested at this velocity with a human payload. The AV coat system used on Artemis was designed and validated for lunar return velocities. Extending it to Mars return velocities is not an incremental upgrade. It requires a fundamental re-evaluation of the ablation physics, the structural response and the failure modes at energy levels that have never been experimentally accessed with a crewed class vehicle. The plasma blackout problem, the communication cutoff caused by ionization of the surrounding air, is also amplified at higher velocities. The plasma sheath becomes denser, more opaque, and persists for a longer duration. At Mars return speeds, the blackout window could extend to 7, 8, or more minutes. That is 8 minutes of falling through fire with no contact, no telemetry, and no way to know if the shield is holding. NASA's own technical roadmaps acknowledge this. The Mars return entry problem is listed as a critical technology gap, a capability that does not currently exist and must be developed before a crewed Mars mission can proceed. It is not a materials engineering problem alone. It is a multi-physics problem that involves aerothermodynamics, ablation chemistry, structural mechanics, and plasma physics, all operating simultaneously at energy levels that push the boundaries of current computational models. This is the wall, not a barrier that can be scaled with more funding or more ambition, but a physics wall that requires solutions we have not invented yet. Artemis II proved that we can barely handle lunar return. Mars return is beyond anything we have validated, and the scaling laws of physics ensure that the gap is not proportional to the velocity difference. It is exponential. And if we somehow solve the re-entry problem, if we develop a heat shield that survives 14 kilometers per second, if we validate it, if we certify it for human flight, we still have to deal with the problem that, in many ways, is even harder than getting there and coming back. We have to keep people alive for 3 years in an environment where everything they need must come with them or be manufactured on site, and the logistics of that requirement are staggering. Part 15. The supply chain impossibility. A single human being in space requires approximately 2.5 kilograms of food per day, about 2.5 litres of drinking water per day, and roughly 0.84 kilograms of oxygen per day. These numbers do not include water for hygiene, water for food preparation, atmospheric nitrogen, CO2 scrubbing capacity, waste processing, or the 1,000 other consumables, medications, spare parts, clothing, cleaning supplies that a crew needs to survive. For a crew of 6 on a 900-day mission, the food requirement alone is approximately 13,500 kilograms. That is 13.5 metric tons of food. Water is heavier. Even with aggressive recycling, the ISS recovers approximately 93% of water through its regenerative systems. The make-up water requirement for a Mars mission is substantial, because no recycling system is 100% efficient, and any failure in the water recovery system requires a reserve that can cover the gap. Total consumables mass for a 6-person, 900-day Mars mission, including food, water reserves, atmospheric gases, medical supplies, spare parts, and contingency stocks, is estimated at somewhere between 40 and 60 metric tons, depending on the level of recycling efficiency and the margin of safety built into the planning. SpaceX's Starship, the largest launch vehicle currently under development, has a projected payload capacity to Mars transit orbit of roughly 100 metric tons. That sounds like more than enough for the consumables, but the consumables are only part of the mass budget. The habitat itself, the landing vehicle, the ascent stage, the power systems, the surface equipment, the spacesuits, the rovers, the scientific instruments, the communication hardware, all of it must be launched from Earth and delivered to Mars. Current estimates for a minimal crewed Mars mission, not colony, just a single expedition, require somewhere between 4 and 10 Starship-class launches, depending on the mission architecture and the degree of in-situ resource utilization. If you want redundancy, if you want a backup habitat, a backup ascent vehicle, a spare life support system, which you absolutely need because there is no rescue mission, the number doubles. Now scale to colonization. A permanent settlement of even 1,000 people, a tiny village by terrestrial standards, requires not just initial supply but continuous resupply until the colony achieves self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency on Mars means manufacturing your own food, your own water, your own oxygen, your own building materials, your own replacement parts, your own medical supplies, and your own energy, from local resources on a planet with toxic soil, no breathable atmosphere, and temperatures that routinely drop below -60 degrees Celsius. The resupply launches required to sustain a colony of 1,000 before self-sufficiency is achieved would number in the hundreds per year. The launch infrastructure, the manufacturing capacity, the fuel production, the mission planning, the logistical chain required to sustain a Mars colony dwarfs anything that has ever been attempted in the history of human civilization. It makes the Berlin airlift look like a grocery run. This is the part of Mars colonization that the visionaries tend to skip over. The rocket is sexy, the landing is dramatic, the first footprint is cinematic. But the 10,000th supply shipment, the spare water pump that needs to arrive before the colony runs dry, the solar panel replacement that is 2 orbital windows late, that is where colonization lives or dies, and it dies because the supply chain is physically, economically, and logistically impossible at the scale required. Artemis II carried a crew of 4 for 10 days in a vehicle that was launched fully provisioned from Earth. Everything they needed was on board before they left. A Mars mission cannot operate that way, and a Mars colony cannot operate without solving the supply chain problem, which we are not within decades of solving. But let us say we solve it. Let us say, for the sake of argument, that someone builds the rockets, launches the supplies, delivers the habitats, and lands 1,000 people on Mars. What then? Can they survive? Can they build a civilization? Can they become self-sustaining? The answer, based on everything we currently know, is no, and the reasons are not what you might expect. Part 16. The colony myth. The idea of a self-sustaining Mars colony has entered public consciousness as an inevitability, not a question of if, but when. The language used by proponents, backup for civilization, multi-planetary species, insurance policy for humanity, frames it as a moral imperative, something we must do for the long-term survival of our kind, and within that framing, the technical challenges are presented as obstacles to be overcome, not limits to be respected. Speed bumps on the highway to destiny. Temporary inconveniences that human ingenuity will sweep aside the way it always has. But let us examine what self-sustaining actually requires. not in the language of TED Talks and investor pitches, in the language of engineering, biology and thermodynamics. Because when you strip away the inspirational music and the CGI renderings of glass-domed cities on red plains, what you are left with is a requirements list that should make anyone paying attention very, very quiet. A self-sustaining colony is one that can survive indefinitely without resupply from Earth. That word indefinitely is doing enormous work in that sentence. It does not mean surviving for a year while the next cargo ship is on its way. It means producing, from local resources, everything a human population needs to stay alive, generation after generation, with no external help. It must produce its own food, its own water, its own breathable atmosphere, its own energy, its own building materials, its own medical equipment, its own electronics, and its own replacement parts for every critical system. Every seal, every valve, every circuit board, every bolt. It must also sustain a genetically diverse population capable of long-term reproduction without the health consequences of inbreeding. A population large enough and varied enough to remain biologically viable across centuries. Start with genetics, because this is a constraint that most Mars plans never mention. Population genetics models vary widely, but most estimates for a minimum viable population, the smallest group that can maintain genetic diversity over multiple generations without significant inbreeding depression, range from around 500 to several thousand individuals. Some models place it as low as 160 if genetic diversity is carefully managed through active selection and reproductive planning, but those models assume a level of genetic intervention and social control that does not yet exist in practice and raises ethical questions that no one has seriously addressed. The point is that a colony of a few dozen or even a few hundred people is not viable over the long term. You need thousands, and you need to get them all to Mars. Not over decades of gradual migration. You need a founding population large enough to carry the genetic diversity from day one, because once the gene pool is established, there is no immigration office on Mars. There is no way to add new genetic material without another interplanetary launch. Now consider food production. Growing crops on Mars requires controlled environment agriculture, sealed greenhouses with artificial lighting, temperature regulation, atmospheric management and soil that has been either imported from Earth at staggering expense or manufactured locally from Martian regolith. And that regolith, the loose, rusty soil on the surface, contains perchlorate, toxic chlorine-based compounds that are lethal to humans and damaging to most plant life. They must be removed before the soil can support agriculture. Removing perchlorates at scale requires chemical processing infrastructure that itself needs to be designed, built, powered, and maintained by the same colony that is trying to eat. Even in controlled environments with clean soil, crop yields are limited by available light, water, nutrients, and atmospheric composition. Mars receives about 43% of the solar energy that Earth does. Supplemental lighting is possible, but it requires electricity, which requires power infrastructure, which requires maintenance, which requires spare parts. Everything connects to everything else. Every system depends on 5 other systems that each depend on 5 more. The most optimistic estimates for Martian agriculture suggest that a colony of 1,000 people would require several 100,000 square meters of greenhouse space, essentially a few hundred football fields of enclosed pressurized growing area. Think about that for a moment. A few hundred football fields of airtight, temperature-controlled, radiation-shielded agricultural space built on a planet where the outside air pressure is less than 1% of Earth's and the average temperature is negative 60 degrees Celsius. Building, pressurizing and maintaining that much enclosed volume on Mars using materials either shipped from Earth or manufactured locally from rock and regolith is a construction project that makes the International Space Station, the single most expensive object ever built by humanity, look like a garden shed. Water on Mars exists primarily as ice in the polar regions and in subsurface deposits at various latitudes. Extracting, purifying and distributing that water requires mining equipment, heating systems, filtration infrastructure, and a distribution network that can operate continuously in an environment where exposed water would either freeze solid or boil away instantly depending on conditions. None of this is impossible in principle. In principle, you can do almost anything. But all of it requires energy, enormous amounts of energy, And on Mars, where solar intensity is less than half of Earth's and planet-wide dust storms can reduce sunlight to a dim haze for weeks or even months at a time, energy is not guaranteed. It is not even reliable. A colony that depends on solar power is a colony that holds its breath every dust season and hopes the panels clear before the batteries die. Nuclear power is a potential alternative and probably a necessary one. But nuclear reactors require fuel, shielding, cooling systems, maintenance expertise, and eventual decommissioning, another chain of dependencies that must be established and sustained on a planet where every component has to be either launched from Earth or manufactured in conditions that make industrial production extraordinarily difficult. Then there is the atmosphere. Mars's atmosphere is 95% carbon dioxide, with virtually no free oxygen. A colony must produce its own oxygen, either by splitting CO2 through electrolysis, which requires significant electrical energy and specialized high-temperature equipment, or through biological processes like algae cultivation or cyanobacterial ecosystems, which require their own closed-loop ecology that has never been demonstrated at the scale required. NASA tested a small oxygen-generating experiment on the Perseverance rover called MOXIE. It produced about 10 grams of oxygen per hour. A single human being requires approximately 840 grams of oxygen per day. MOXIE, operating at full capacity, could sustain one person for about 1 hour out of 24. Scaling that to a colony of 1,000 requires not an incremental improvement, but an industrial oxygen production facility that does not yet exist in any form. The International Space Station is the closest analogue we have to a closed-loop life support system, and it is not even close to self-sustaining. The ISS recycles some of its water, about 93%, and generates some of its oxygen through electrolysis. But it depends on regular resupply missions for food, spare parts, atmospheric gases, clothing, medical supplies, and equipment. After more than 25 years of continuous operation, the most expensive and sophisticated orbital habitat ever constructed remains fundamentally dependent on Earth for survival. It cannot last 6 months without a cargo delivery, and the ISS is in low Earth orbit, 400 kilometers away, where a resupply mission takes a few hours to plan and a few days to execute. Mars is 200 million kilometers away, and resupply takes 2 years, minimum. A self-sustaining Mars colony is not a colony that has everything figured out before the first crew arrives. It is a colony that has built an entire industrial civilization, mining, refining, smelting, manufacturing, chemical processing, agriculture, water treatment, power generation, medical care, education, governance, and maintenance from scratch, on a planet that is actively hostile to human life in every measurable way, with no possibility of quick resupply, no emergency evacuation, and no margin for the kind of cascading system failure that, on Earth, we call a bad week and on Mars we would call extinction. No human settlement has ever achieved that level of self-sufficiency, even on Earth. Even the most isolated communities in human history, Polynesian islanders who navigated thousands of miles of open ocean, Arctic indigenous groups who survived in conditions that would kill an unprepared person in hours, remote agricultural societies that went generations without outside contact, every single one of them depended on their planet's atmosphere, water cycle, biosphere, and gravity. They breathed the air for free, they drank the rain, they ate what grew in soil that was already alive with billions of microorganisms. On Mars, there is no biosphere, there is no water cycle, there is no breathable air, there is no living soil, there is no weather you can survive, there is no food chain to tap into. Everything must be manufactured, everything must be maintained, everything must work all the time or people die. The colony myth is not that Mars colonization is difficult. Everyone agrees it is difficult. The myth is that Mars colonization is an engineering problem, a very hard version of building a bridge or launching a satellite, something that scales with enough money and enough talent. It is not. It is a systems of systems problem of a kind that humanity has never successfully managed, where every subsystem depends on every other subsystem, where failure in any one of them cascades through all the others, and where the margin for error is essentially zero because there is no external support to fall back on. There is no neighbour to borrow from. There is no emergency shipment. There is no second chance that arrives in a week. Artemis II carried 4 people for 10 days in a vehicle that weighed roughly 33 metric tons and cost tens of billions of dollars to develop. Those 4 people brought everything they needed with them. They did not grow food, they did not mine water, they did not manufacture oxygen. They survived on supplies packed on Earth and consumed on a schedule measured in hours. A self-sustaining Mars colony of 1,000 people would require not a vehicle but an entire civilization, built from nothing, on a world that offers nothing, with no safety net and no rescue mission. That is not a stepping stone. That is a fantasy dressed in engineering language, and recognizing it as a fantasy is not defeatism. It is not giving up. It is the beginning of honesty, the kind of honesty that might actually lead to progress if we let it. But if the technical barriers are this severe, if the radiation, the biology, the logistics, the re-entry physics, and the sustainability challenge all point in the same direction, then the question becomes, why do we keep talking about it as though it is going to happen? Why does the narrative persist in the face of the evidence? And the answer to that question takes us out of engineering and into something murkier, something more human, and in some ways, something more disturbing. Part 17. The cost we're not willing to pay. The Artemis program, as of 2026, has cost American taxpayers approximately $93 billion. Let that number sit for a moment. $93 billion. That figure includes the development of the Space Launch System rocket, the Orion capsule, the ground systems at Kennedy Space Center, the supporting infrastructure spread across NASA centers and contractor facilities, and the missions flown to date. For that investment, an investment larger than the annual economic output of entire nations, we have completed one uncrewed test flight, one crewed flyby, and we are preparing for a lunar landing that is still being scheduled and has already been delayed multiple times. $93 billion. For context, that is roughly the annual GDP of Kenya, a country of 55 million people. It is more than the combined GDP of several dozen smaller nations. It is more than the entire annual budget of most federal agencies, and it has produced, in terms of human spaceflight capability, a vehicle that can send 4 people to the moon and back, if the heat shield works as expected on this particular flight, if the solar weather cooperates during the specific window they are flying through, and if nothing unexpected goes wrong in a vehicle that has completed exactly one crewed mission. That is what $93 billion buys you. A conditional capability for a short-duration lunar mission with caveats attached to every critical system. And I want to be clear, that is not waste. Developing a crewed deep space vehicle is genuinely difficult. The engineering is real. The challenges are real. The people working on it are brilliant and dedicated. But the ratio of investment to demonstrated capability tells you something important about the economics of what comes next. Because the moon is the easy part. Now, a crewed Mars program, not a colony, not a permanent settlement, not a civilization, just a single round-trip mission with a crew of 4 to 6 people, there and back, survive and return, is estimated to cost somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion. That range depends on the architecture chosen, the timeline for development, the degree of international cost-sharing, and most critically, the level of risk mitigation built into the planning. The lower estimates tend to assume optimistic timelines, heavy reliance on a single launch vehicle like Starship, and risk tolerances that would make most safety engineers uncomfortable. The higher estimates assume the level of redundancy and safety margin that you would actually want for a mission where there is no abort to Earth option, no rescue scenario, and no possibility of an early return if something goes wrong. Those higher estimates are the serious ones. They are the ones produced by people who have to sign their names to the Mission Safety Review. $1 trillion. That is a staggering number, but here is the thing that makes this part of the argument more nuanced than it might first appear. It is not an impossible number. It is a large number. It is an uncomfortable number. But it is not beyond the reach of human civilization. Global military spending in 2024 was approximately $2.63 trillion in a single year. The United States alone spent nearly $900 billion on defense. The combined GDP of the G7 nations exceeds $45 trillion annually. A $1 trillion Mars program spread over 25 years would cost roughly $40 billion per year, less than 5% of annual US defense spending. The money exists. It is simply spent on other things that governments and electorates have decided matter more. NASA's budget in 2026 is roughly $25 billion, which represents about 0.5% of the total federal budget. Half of 1%. During the Apollo era, at the peak of the space race in the mid-1960s, NASA's share of the federal budget was approximately 4.5%, 9 times what it is today. And Apollo was not a sustained exploration program. It was a targeted, politically motivated sprint. Get to the moon before the Soviets, plant the flag, come home, declare victory. The entire crewed lunar program, from Kennedy's speech to Armstrong's footprint, lasted less than a decade. And even with that level of funding, that level of political urgency, and that level of public enthusiasm, the program was cancelled almost immediately after its goal was achieved. The last 3 planned Apollo missions were cut. The Saturn V production line was shut down. The capability to reach the moon was deliberately abandoned because the political will that created it evaporated the moment the geopolitical objective was met. That history matters because it tells you something fundamental about how large-scale space programs actually work. They do not run on engineering, they run on political energy, and political energy is the most volatile fuel source in the world. It surges with a crisis, with a rival, with a speech that captures the national imagination, and it dissipates the moment the crisis passes, the rival stumbles, or the next election cycle shifts attention to healthcare, immigration, the economy, or whatever issue is dominating the news cycle that month. A Mars program cannot survive on political energy. It is too long. It requires sustained commitment across 5, 6, possibly 7 presidential administrations. It requires Congress to approve escalating budgets year after year for a program whose payoff is decades away and whose risks are enormous. It requires maintaining public support for a project that will consume billions annually while producing, for most of its duration, nothing visible, no launches, no landings, just laboratories and test articles and engineering reviews. The exciting parts come at the end. The bills come every year. The financial reality, then, is not that Mars is too expensive to afford, it is that Mars is too expensive to prioritize, and there is an important difference between those two statements. The first suggests a hard limit, we simply do not have the money. That is false. The second suggests a choice, we have the money, but we choose to spend it elsewhere. That is true, and that choice is not irrational, it is not short-sighted, it is not a failure of vision, it is a calculation made by societies where billions of people still lack clean water, where healthcare systems are underfunded, where infrastructure is crumbling, where climate adaptation requires trillions of dollars of investment over the coming decades, and where the political consequences of ignoring those problems are immediate and severe, while the political consequences of delaying a Mars mission are essentially zero. In that context, spending $1 trillion to send 6 people to a planet where they might die, where, based on everything we have discussed in this video, the probability of mission failure is uncomfortably high, is an extraordinarily difficult political proposition. Not because voters are uninspired, because voters are rational. This connects to the central thread in a way that is often overlooked in discussions about Mars feasibility. We spend most of our time talking about the technical barriers, the radiation, the heat shields, the biology, the logistics, and those barriers are real and formidable. But even if every one of them were solved tomorrow morning, if some breakthrough in materials science and radiation biology and closed-loop life support handed us a technically viable Mars architecture by next Tuesday, the funding required to implement those solutions would demand a level of sustained political and economic commitment that has no precedent in human history. None. Apollo is the closest comparison, and Apollo lasted 8 years with 9 times the budget share and a superpower rivalry providing the motivation. Mars requires 25 to 30 years with a fraction of the budget share and no equivalent geopolitical driver. The math does not work. Not because the money is not there, but because the sustained political will to allocate the money has never existed for any project of this scale and duration in any country for any purpose. The cost is not the barrier. The unwillingness to pay the cost is the barrier. And that unwillingness is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of the human spirit. It is the product of competing priorities that are, by any objective measure, more immediate and more urgent. People are dying of preventable diseases right now. Cities are flooding right now. Power grids are failing right now. The argument that we should redirect $1 trillion toward a mission with uncertain survival odds on a planet that cannot support human life without continuous technological intervention, that argument has to compete with every other claim on those same resources, and it loses. Not always, not entirely, but enough that the funding never reaches the level required, the timelines never hold, and the programs get restructured every time a new administration takes office. Which raises the question that follows logically from everything we have just discussed. If even the money is not there, if the economic commitment required for Mars exceeds what any political system has demonstrated the capacity to sustain, what about the international cooperation? What about the global coordination that a project of this magnitude would demand? Because a $1 trillion program is hard enough for one country. A Mars program that actually works might require something humanity has never managed to pull off, and the evidence for that is not encouraging. Part 18. The Political Fracture. In 2020, NASA introduced the Artemis Accords, a set of bilateral agreements establishing principles for the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. As of 2026, more than 40 nations have signed, from traditional spacefaring powers like Japan, Canada, and the United Kingdom to emerging space nations across South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. It is the largest international framework for space cooperation since the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, a document that was itself drafted during the Cold War, when the primary concern was preventing nuclear weapons from being placed in orbit. The Artemis Accords represent, on paper, a genuine step forward, a shared set of principles for how nations should behave as they expand their activities beyond Earth. Transparency in operations, notification of activities, interoperability of systems, guidelines for the extraction and use of space resources. It sounds like progress, and in a narrow diplomatic sense, it is. But for the purposes of what we are discussing, whether humanity can mount the kind of sustained, coordinated effort required to send humans to Mars and keep them alive, the Artemis Accords are, in a very real and very uncomfortable sense, inadequate. Not because they are badly written, not because the principles are wrong, but because they are the wrong tool for the job. They are a gentleman's agreement being asked to support the weight of a civilization-scale engineering program, and gentlemen's agreements do not build spacecraft. The Artemis Accords are not a treaty. This is not a technicality. It is a fundamental structural limitation. A treaty under international law carries binding obligations. It can include enforcement mechanisms, dispute resolution procedures, penalties for non-compliance, and formal withdrawal processes. The Accords have none of these. They are bilateral agreements, each nation signs separately with the United States, and their provisions are aspirational, not obligatory. No nation that signs the Accords is legally required to contribute funding, share technology, provide launch capacity, or participate in any specific mission. They are agreeing to principles, not commitments. More critically, the Accords do not include China, which operates the second most capable space program in the world and is actively pursuing its own crewed lunar program with a targeted landing before 2030. China has built and operates its own space station. The Tiangong has successfully landed rovers on the Moon and Mars and has demonstrated the full spectrum of capabilities: launch, rendezvous, docking, sample return, deep space communication that a Mars program would require. Any serious international Mars effort that excludes China is an international effort that is missing one of its most capable potential partners. And the exclusion is not accidental. It is the direct result of US legislation, the Wolf Amendment, passed in 2011, that prohibits NASA from engaging in bilateral cooperation with China without explicit congressional approval. The law was motivated by national security concerns about technology transfer, and those concerns are not trivial. But the consequence is that the two nations most capable of contributing to a Mars program are legally prevented from working together on one. The Accords also do not include Russia, which, despite its declining space infrastructure and the geopolitical isolation following its invasion of Ukraine, retains significant institutional knowledge, launch capability, life support expertise honed over decades on the Mir and ISS programs, and, perhaps most relevantly, advanced research in nuclear thermal propulsion, one of the few propulsion technologies that could meaningfully reduce Mars transit times and thereby reduce crew radiation exposure. Russian expertise in long-duration spaceflight accumulated through missions that kept cosmonauts in orbit for over a year, represents a body of knowledge that no other nation has replicated at the same scale. Excluding Russia from a Mars effort is not just a political inconvenience, it is the deliberate removal of a critical knowledge base from the program. So what do the Accords actually create? They create a framework of norms, expectations about behaviour, communication, and resource use among a coalition of nations that are primarily aligned with the United States geopolitically. That is useful for coordinating lunar surface activities, avoiding interference between national programs, and establishing precedents for resource extraction. It is not useful for funding a $1 trillion Mars program, distributing technical risk across multiple space agencies, or maintaining political alignment over the 25 to 30-year development timeline that Mars demands. A Mars program of the scale necessary to establish even a temporary human presence, not a colony, not a settlement, just a crew that lands, survives, and returns, would need contributions from every major spacefaring nation. Not because any single nation lacks the theoretical capability to do it alone, but because no single nation has demonstrated the political willingness to fund it alone. The United States could afford a Mars program. It could also afford universal healthcare, a fully modernized electrical grid, and the elimination of student debt. The question is never capability, it is always priority, and distributing the cost across multiple nations is the only realistic path to making the priority argument survivable in any single nation's domestic politics. That means shared technology development, which requires trust between nations that are simultaneously competing in military space, surveillance, and missile technology. It means shared launch capacity, which requires interoperability standards that take years to negotiate and decades to implement. It means shared risk, which means shared accountability when things go wrong, when crews are lost, when budgets overrun, when a partner nation has an election, and the new government questions the program's value. And it means political stability across multiple administrations in multiple countries over a timeline that exceeds most people's careers. The International Space Station is the closest precedent we have for this kind of multinational space cooperation, and its history is instructive in ways that should worry anyone planning for Mars. The ISS partnership between NASA, Roscosmos, ESA, JAXA, and CSA required more than a decade of negotiation before a single module was launched in 1998. The original concept, Space Station Freedom, was proposed by President Reagan in 1984. 14 years of redesigns, budget fights, partner negotiations, and political upheaval passed before the first element reached orbit. 14 years just to agree on what to build and who would pay for it. And the ISS is a 400-kilometre commute from Earth. It is serviced by multiple launch vehicles from multiple nations on a routine basis. Crew rotations happen every 6 months. Cargo arrives every few weeks. The risks, while real, are manageable. The costs, while significant, roughly $150 billion over the life of the program, are distributed across 5 agencies and amortized over 3 decades. The ISS partnership has survived geopolitical crises that would have killed lesser collaborations. It survived the Columbia disaster. It survived the end of the Space Shuttle program. It survived the annexation of Crimea in 2014. It survived the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which led to the near-total collapse of the US-Russian diplomatic relationship in virtually every other domain. Through all of that, cosmonauts and astronauts continued to launch together, live together, and work together on the station. That resilience is remarkable, and it is often cited as evidence that international space cooperation can endure political turbulence. But the ISS analogy has limits, and those limits matter. The ISS works because the stakes are manageable. If a partner nation withdraws, the station can be reconfigured. If a supply mission fails, another can be launched within weeks. If a crew member becomes ill, they can return to Earth in hours. The entire partnership operates within a safety net of proximity, redundancy, and reversibility. None of those conditions apply to Mars. A Mars program has no redundancy at the mission level. If a critical partner pulls out during the development phase, the program collapses or is delayed by years. During the mission itself, there is no resupply, no crew swap, no emergency return. The commitment is total and irreversible in a way that the ISS has never demanded. Mars requires something qualitatively different from anything humanity has accomplished in international cooperation. It requires the kind of civilization-level coordination that we have never achieved for any purpose. Consider the evidence. Climate change is a global existential threat backed by overwhelming scientific consensus, and after 3 decades of international negotiations, global carbon emissions are still rising. Nuclear disarmament has been a stated goal of every major power since the 1960s, and the global stockpile, while reduced from its Cold War peak, still contains enough warheads to end civilization several times over. Pandemic prevention was supposed to be the lesson of COVID-19, and within 3 years of the worst pandemic in a century, global health funding had already begun to decline and international coordination frameworks had weakened. Poverty reduction, biodiversity protection, ocean conservation, every major global challenge that requires sustained multinational cooperation over decades has either stalled, regressed, or achieved results far below what was promised. We have never sustained a global cooperative project at the scale and duration that Mars demands. Not once, not for anything. And the evidence suggests not that we are incapable of cooperation, the ISS proves we are under the right conditions, but that we are incapable of sustaining cooperation at the required intensity, for the required duration, without the kind of immediate existential pressure that Mars does not provide. Mars is not about to hit us. Mars is not spreading a virus. Mars is not melting the ice caps. Mars is just there, red and silent and patient, waiting for a species that cannot agree on how to share a planet to somehow agree on how to share the cost of reaching another one. The political fracture is not a secondary concern that can be addressed after the engineering is figured out. It is foundational. It is load-bearing. Because even if the physics was solved, even if the biology was solved, even if the heat shields worked and the radiation was blocked and the food grew and the water flowed, even if every technical barrier fell away tomorrow, the program would still require political continuity across decades, budget stability across administrations, and international trust across geopolitical fault lines. And in a world where administrations change every 4 to 8 years, where priorities shift with every election cycle, where funding for basic science is among the first items cut in austerity budgets, and where the nations most capable of contributing to a Mars program are simultaneously the nations most likely to view each other as strategic rivals. In that world, the political infrastructure for Mars simply does not exist, and building it would be at least as difficult as building the rocket, arguably more so, because rockets obey physics, politics obeys nothing. Which brings us to a question that has been lurking beneath this entire discussion, a question that is less about capability and more about motivation. If the technical barriers are real, the funding is insufficient, and the political cooperation is absent, why does the Mars narrative persist? Why does it dominate public discourse about the future of space? And who benefits from keeping the dream alive even when the data says the dream is decades premature at best and fundamentally unachievable at worst? Part 19. The Hidden Narrative War. There is a story about Mars that you have been hearing for years, and it goes something like this. Humanity is destined to become a multi-planetary species. Mars is the next frontier. We will build a city on the red planet within our lifetimes. It is not a question of if, but when. And the leading character in this story, the one whose name is most associated with it, is the CEO of SpaceX. Now, let me be careful here, because this is a conversation that generates more heat than light. The vision of Mars colonization has done something genuinely valuable. It has inspired a generation of engineers and scientists. It has attracted billions of dollars of private investment into launch vehicle development. It has accelerated progress in reusable rocketry, manufacturing efficiency, and mission design. The Starship program, whatever you think of its timeline or its promises, is producing hardware that has real-world applications in satellite deployment, lunar logistics, and beyond. But there is a gap between the narrative and the reality, and that gap deserves honest examination. One theory, held by some analysts in the space industry, is that the Mars narrative functions primarily as a funding story, a grand vision that attracts investment, recruits talent, and generates public enthusiasm, while the near-term business model is built on Starlink, government launch contracts, and lunar missions. Under this interpretation, Mars is not a lie, but it is not an imminent plan either. It is an aspiration, a North Star, and the actual engineering milestones are more modest and more achievable than the headline suggests. Another interpretation is more generous, that the Mars vision is sincere, that the long-term goal is real, and that the timeline is simply optimistic, as all engineering timelines are, but that the direction is correct even if the arrival date is wrong. The truth is probably some combination of both, and it is not my place to assign motives to individuals. What I can say, based on everything we have discussed in this video, is that the gap between the public narrative of Mars colonization and the scientific consensus on its feasibility is enormous, and it is growing, not shrinking. Every year, as we learn more about the deep space radiation environment, the physiological effects of long-duration spaceflight, the logistical requirements of sustained off-world presence, and the material science limitations of re-entry systems. Every year, the data pushes the timeline further out, not closer in. The narrative says 10 years. The data says, we do not know, possibly never, without breakthroughs that have not yet occurred. And the danger of the narrative is not that it inspires people. Inspiration is good. The danger is that it substitutes for strategy, that it allows policymakers, engineers, and the public to believe that the problem is being solved when in fact the foundational challenges remain untouched. Belief in Mars colonization may be driven more by narrative than by readiness, and if we're going to take the dream seriously, we need to take the obstacles seriously too. Which brings us finally to the conclusion, to the thing that Artemis II actually proved when you strip away the celebration and look at the data. Part 20. The terrifying truth. Let me walk you through what we know. The radiation environment in deep space exceeds human survivability limits for a Mars duration mission. We have no material that can adequately shield a crew from galactic cosmic rays without generating dangerous secondary particles. We have no pharmaceutical countermeasure that protects DNA from ionizing radiation in real time. We have no active shielding technology that can be deployed on a crewed vehicle. The European Space Agency has publicly stated that a crewed Mars mission is not currently viable due to radiation alone. The heat shield technology validated on Artemis II was a modified, untested configuration that had never flown at lunar velocity with a crew, and even that configuration was a workaround for unexplained failures on the previous uncrewed flight. A Mars return re-entry occurs at 3 km per second faster than lunar return, generating roughly 8 times the radiative heating. No crewed system has ever been designed for that regime, and no heat shield has ever been tested at that velocity with humans on board. The human body degrades in microgravity at rates that compound over the 2.5 to 3 year duration of a Mars mission. Bone loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, vision impairment, immune suppression, and these effects synergize with radiation damage in ways that are poorly understood and have no tested countermeasure for multi-year durations. The psychological environment of a Mars mission, total isolation, communication delays of up to 24 minutes, no possibility of rescue, no possibility of early return, has no precedent in human experience and no validated mitigation strategy for the durations involved. The logistics of sustaining even a small crew on Mars for the required 500-day surface stay demand a supply chain of unprecedented complexity, and the logistics of sustaining a colony are orders of magnitude beyond that. The political and economic infrastructure required to fund and coordinate a Mars program does not exist, and shows no sign of emerging, and the re-entry physics of returning from Mars exist in a regime that current technology cannot address. Every one of these is a hard problem. Some may be solvable with sufficient time, funding, and scientific breakthrough, but none of them are being solved right now, and several of them, radiation shielding, re-entry physics, closed-loop life support at scale, are not incrementally improvable. They require qualitative leaps in capability that are not on any current development roadmap. Artemis II was not a stepping stone to Mars, it was a diagnostic test, and the diagnosis is this: we are further from Mars than we were when we started dreaming about it, because we now understand the obstacles in a way we did not before. When Apollo 17 left the lunar surface in December of 1972, there was a sense, naive in retrospect, but real, that Mars was next, that the Moon was the practice lap and the red planet was the main event. 54 years later, we have returned to the Moon's neighbourhood, and what we found there was not a launching pad, it was a mirror, a reflection of exactly how far we have not come. The distinction that matters is this: we can visit. We might someday be able to survive, but colonize, build a civilization, sustain a population, that requires capabilities that are not delayed. They do not exist. I want to be clear about what I'm not saying. I am not saying we should stop exploring. I am not saying Artemis is a failure. I am not saying space is a waste of money. Artemis II was a genuine achievement. 4 humans travelled farther from Earth than anyone in history and returned safely. That matters. That is real. But achievement and capability are not the same thing. And the narrative that frames Artemis as a step toward Mars is not supported by the data that Artemis itself produced. The data says we are barely competent at the Moon. The data says deep space is more hostile than our models predicted. The data says the human body, the human mind, and our best technology are all operating at their limits on a 10-day mission. And the mission we keep promising requires 900. There is a photograph that the Artemis II crew took during their lunar transit. It shows Earth as a small blue disk against the blackness, reduced by distance to something that fits behind your thumb if you hold your hand at arm's length. That image has been taken before by the Apollo crews, by Voyager, by every spacecraft that has looked back. But the Artemis II version carries something new. It carries the knowledge of what the crew was experiencing while they looked at it. The radiation alarms, the heat shield uncertainty, the solar storms rolling in, the awareness that everything between them and that tiny blue disk was trying to kill them, quietly, persistently, in ways that would not be fully understood until long after they came home. That image is not an invitation to expand. It is a reminder of where we actually live, of the only place in the known universe where a human being can stand outside, unprotected, and survive. We are not a multi-planetary species. We are not close to becoming one. And the honest reckoning with that truth, the willingness to look at the data and say, not yet and maybe not ever, unless we do something fundamentally different, that reckoning is the real beginning of progress. Artemis II did not show us how to reach Mars. It showed us how far away we still are from surviving it. The question is whether we will adapt, whether the breakthroughs will come in materials science, in radiation biology, in closed-loop ecology, in political cooperation, in human resilience. Maybe they will. Maybe in 50 years or 100 or 200, we will look back at this moment and laugh at how limited our thinking was. Or maybe we will look at that photograph of Earth, small, blue, alone, and finally understand what it was telling us all along, that this is it, this is home, and taking care of it might be the bravest exploration we ever do.